the heartbeat of the city, madness swirls. Echoes bounce off concrete dreams lost and found. Battles fought in alleyways, revolution sound. Green and gray skyscrapers watch without a soul. In the heart of Manila where stories unfold. Alex and Ivan cry out loudly for truth. Scream for justice like a fever broken youth. Every word's a bullet tearing through the night. In this war of words.
And
See
this is SITREP PH, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Filipino interests. I'm Ivan at home, coming to you live from the great city of Manila. With me is my host, Inform PH. Inform, Alex, how have you
Hi
been?
everyone.
How's your
Happy
weekend?
Sunday. Doing really well. I went to a fun run in just in the morning. It happened on Mall of Asia. So it's called Takbo para sa West Philippine Sea. So there were around 7,000 attendees, right? So the purpose of the event is to raise awareness in the West Philippine Sea issue. So, yes, happy Sunday, everyone. So, to start off our podcast, in the news, Philippine forces will respond with equal force if the Chinese Coast Guard attacks happen again. So, last month, Ivan, in the South China Sea, Chinese personnel armed with machetes and spears injured Filipino Navy members and damaged two boats in a chaotic confrontation. So, General Romeo Bronner Jr., the Armed Forces of the Philippines chief, has demanded China to pay 60 million pesos for the damaged Navy boats and return the 7 rifles taken during the June 17 clash that happened at Ayungin Shoal, which of course left several Filipino personnel injured. So,
And also
Ivan?
also in the news, U.S. mid-range missiles will also remain in the country for much longer. This was confirmed by Colonel Louis Demaala, the Philippine Army spokesperson, who said that the mid-range capability missiles will remain that were brought over from the recent Balacan exercises will continue to remain in the Philippines for the time being, and with no idea, with no comment on when they would be removed. So, Alex.
So to help us understand the latest happenings in the West Philippine Sea, Ivan, and the Indo-Pacific region, we have with us Don McLAIN, GILL with us. Did I pronounce it right? So he's a geopolitical analyst, author, and lecturer at De La Salle University, and the director for South and Southeast Asia at the Philippine Middle East Studies Association. He focuses on Philippine foreign policy, India, Southeast Asian relations, and Indo-Pacific geopolitics. So, Don, could you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and your work? We see you often being interviewed in the media talking about the West Philippine Sea. But what's your background and how did you get interested in geopolitics?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a true pleasure to have this, candid discussion on very important topics, right? And again, thank you for the kind introduction. So, as for me, if we look at backgrounds, as far as backgrounds are concerned, I'm Filipino of Indian origin. And from the get-go, my area of research and expertise revolves around Philippine foreign policy, particularly in areas of maritime security. And we also look into India-Southeast Asian relations, as you have just mentioned, and basically the intersection of various traditional and non-traditional geopolitical dynamics taking place in the Indo-Pacific, what we call today as the Indo-Pacific. So these areas have been pretty much the crux of my work, whether it's my publications, my academic journey and, of course, my overarching career. So, yes, again, thank you very much for having me. It's a true pleasure.
Yeah, and a bit of a more personal icebreaker question to start us off. You clearly have a deep love for the Philippines and Philippine democracy and Republican virtues. I saw on your post during Independence Day last month about, how it's like growing up as natural born Filipino of Indian origin in this country, and how you proudly witnessed our multicultural mentality and our democratic values. So can you tell us how that was like growing up as, growing up in the Philippines from an Indian origin family, and tell us about your background and how you fell in love with the country?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Philippines is my home, and this is where it all began. And um, I have been highly integrated into society and the Philippine culture, and of course a wide array of affairs that take place within the country. And I'm from the get go, I'm Filipino, right? But of course, what makes it even more interesting for me is, of course, to look into how multiculturalism, as I mentioned in that post, has become a very important defining factor of our democracy here in the country. So, having, of course, my roots and ethnicities, rooted in India, right?
Yes.
It's clear to see how we have various communities in the country, from Filipino Chinese communities to other forms of communities as well. And representing, of course, the Filipino Indian community, it's wonderful to really witness, this dynamicism taking place in our society. And that in itself, I feel, is one of the strengths of our country, to be able to work along with these, very dynamics, right? And I think that really is a defining factor of what a vibrant democracy is all about.
So I guess we can start with our first actual policy question, which is your recent reactions to the event in the West Philippine Sea and China's escalations. So we have Ray Powell, our mutual on Twitter, over there tracking another resupply mission currently being undertaken to Ayungin Shoal, with the BRP Cobra and BRP Cape being shadowed by the China Coast Guard and Maritime Militia. And naturally, we also have the AFP giving a green signal to Filipino sailors and our forces to repel with force if necessary Chinese boarding of our vessels if they were to try that again. And then naturally, there's the American missile defense system. So a lot of things are happening right now, especially this week, and things are getting heated, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. What we have to look into here is, of course, the fact that China is displeased with the fact that the Philippines is continuously and consistently standing up for what is rightfully its own, based on international law and clause 2016 arbitral ruling, of course, its anniversary coming up, this month, this year. So we can definitely say that this is something that is not in line with the interests of an expansionist power such as China. And of course, such rules and institutions that govern our external relations and, of course, our position within our territory, our sovereignty, and our sovereign rights, all these things do not really bode well for a revisionist and expansionist power. So clearly, China is trying to see how far it could go in trying to provoke Manila's and bend Manila's political will, first of all, and of course try to tarnish the effort that Manila has placed in securing and expanding its defense network and security networks throughout the Indo-Pacific and beyond.
So Don, you've been vocal about the Philippines' stance on territorial disputes in the West Philippine Sea. How do you see the country's approach to these disputes evolving, and what challenges does Philippines face in asserting its sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea?
Well, I think the first and primary challenge that we really have is, of course, that lack of consistency that we could see based on our position towards the West Philippine Sea and the
Yes.
US-China dynamics as well, particularly since the end of the Cold War. And the reason I say at the end of the Cold War is because this was the start of this new burgeoning structural condition that we are seeing today in the form of the U.S.-China power competition. And it was only in 2010 that we really sought to revert towards maritime security. And even since 2010, we have seen a lot of fluctuations that took place. But what we are doing now is that we are sort of learning from our past mistakes and, of course, trying to set the standard straight in terms of asserting what is rightfully ours, right? Asserting our sovereignty and sovereign rights at the face of Chinese expansionism. The second problem that we have is, despite the fact that we have been inconsistent, throughout the decades, China has actually been quite consistent. And I've always argued that, since the creation of the PRC in 1949, it has already exhibited, this hunger for territorial expansion, either continental or maritime, starting off with Tibet to Aksai Chin, to Shaksgam Valley in South Asia, and towards new claims in South Asia as well, and towards Southeast Asia. And today we are seeing China equally trying to push the envelope vis-a-vis Vietnam towards the Gulf of Tonkin, for example, which does not really bode well for Vietnam either. So as we can clearly see here, the Philippines is within that position as well. We are at the crossroads of Chinese expansionism, the traditional sphere of U.S. influence, and within this dynamics, we are ensuring that our agency is recognized, right? So that is a third challenge, how to strengthen, how to maintain that agency amidst great power competition. And from what I can see is that since 2023, it's been roughly 2 years, that we have demonstrated that if we put our political will, right, and the whole of the nation approach towards, what is rightfully ours, based on the West Philippine Sea, our position in the West Philippine Sea. A lot of significant developments can be achieved in such a short span of time, and that's what we've seen. How the Philippines has been able to set the tone in terms of its expanding partnerships, right, and broadening the scope of the U.S.-Philippine alliance on one hand, forging deeper relations with non-traditional partners. So, there are a lot of things going on, but then the challenges still loom.
And I guess going on to that about the shift in Philippine foreign policy as how it's become more stable and how it's become more consistent and effective. I mean, you've written and spoken about the shift in that the Philippines has undertaken under the Marcos administration, specifically compared to the Duterte administration, and how it seems more robust and it seems more assertive in its outlook. Can you perhaps give examples on the major changes that specifically in Philippine foreign policy and how it's affecting the situation in the West Philippine Sea?
Right. So first of all, we have to understand that our position is clearly that of being people-centric, right? Defense-oriented and agency-driven, right? So what does that mean? When we talk about being people-centric, right? Specifically on the West Philippine Sea, that's the question, right? So how is the Philippines positioning itself within the West Philippine Sea? So first of all, we have to understand that various frameworks that have been really forwarded under this current government or proposed under this current government all have that specific focus on the inalienable right of every Filipino to gain access or to have access to the resources in the West Philippine Sea, right? So look at the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, for example. There is that that level of clarity as to the need to shift our military modernization, our foreign policy, along with our the amalgamation of our strategic position towards safeguarding our sovereignty and sovereign rights in the maritime domain for the purpose of securing that those very inalienable rights that each Filipino has, right? And if you look into the Maritime Zones Act, for example, it allows the Philippines to govern its waters more effectively. The archipelagic waters, the territorial sea, the continental shelf, the exclusive economic zone. All these aspects have been very much integrated, and for the Philippines to actually, signal to the international community about what it expects others to do, within its waters, right? So it's us setting the tone as well, and really, really is significant in terms of the level of, the signaling that we are showing, that we are well aware that these waters are ours, right? And of course, to set the mode of conduct, similar to how, ASEAN, for instance, was able to get very powers across the continent to sign the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, right? So similarly, the Maritime Zones Act, for instance, is a major framework that the Philippines has put forward in its governance of its waters, and to also ensure that its partners in other countries around the world are able to recognize how the Philippines wants them to act and behave within this particular domain. So it's a very agency-driven position as
Yes.
well. So would you wanna follow up on that, or?
No, I want to follow up because you rightly mentioned this is a very people-centric and this is a very assertive policy when it comes to protecting our interests. But this rightly, several of our guests brought it up. This rubs very much against China's expansionist powers, expansionist claims, as you mentioned earlier. This is a rising power, and as most rising powers do, they tend to interfere and try to gain influence over their local neighbors. And I guess many here in the Philippines, especially those with a more pessimistic or doomer mentality, would say that, how long can we maintain these rising tensions? And not just in terms of our material and moral cost, but also on like how high can we climb up the escalation ladder whilst ensuring that it doesn't go into a full-blown war? Like how long, what's the off-ramp here? When Philippine interests and Chinese expansionism clash.
Right. Well, we have to understand that within, Manila's current foreign policy is, of course, a prioritization of keeping all lines of communication with Beijing open, right? Because at the end of the day, our position, the Manila's position, is that these disputes that we have with China, the conflict of interest we have with China, can eventually and only be alleviated through dialogue, right? So what we're doing is that we are ensuring that we are crafting a more level playing field, right? Because China understands only one language, and that is a language of force, a language of power, right? And clearly, given the asymmetry in our power relations, we have to go above and beyond through internal and external balancing, right? To ensure that China gets the message across. Now, the problem is that for the longest time, China has not really felt the cost of its expansionist ambitions in the West Philippine Sea, and that has been due to the on one hand, inconsistency in our policies. Second, the fluctuation in the U.S. alliance, within the region as well. Now, China has been able to take advantage of these particular vacuums and loopholes. For instance, in 1999. When the United States clearly stated its position of being neutral in terms of the disputes in the South China Sea, China felt that was a free pass. And, conveniently, 1999 was also the year when China announced its fishing ban, right? Which continues up to this very year. Similarly, what happened in 1994, 1995, Mischief Reef. We saw what happened in 2012. And it was only in 2019 when, the U.S. sort of clarified as well the geographic scope of the Mutual Defense Treaty, which is within the South China Sea. That was under Trump, for instance. And of course, today we are seeing a little bit more clarity, right, on the provisions and clarifying the provisions of the MDT. So again, that's another step, so that's clarity in terms of the U.S.-Philippine alliance, but we still have much to do, right, in terms of solidifying the clarity. But, these shifts in the past, the loopholes within these dynamics in the past have really allowed China to become what it has become today, right? And old habits die hard. This is something that we would need to sort of, that we would need to take into consideration. So the goal here is to apply more cost to allow China to feel that its actions in the West Philippines are costly, right? So this is how we seek to have a multi-pronged strategy, a multi-pronged position towards China. So like other Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, it's not just one strategy that addresses the China issue. One strategy in itself, is insufficient and would have several drawbacks. But a series of strategies that we are able to incorporate in this point in time, as I mentioned, through both internal and external balancing, when done together, when put together, becomes more effective, right? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to attack the situation in all forms, in all levels. But of course, this would require a longer stage, right? A longer stage of operationalization. And that is one of the major challenges, because China has patience, China has time, right? It is not a democratic country. It does not succumb to the shift in political dynamics, right? In political perception. So continuity, patience, and deep pockets, right? These are the advantages that China possesses. So it is also in a wait and watch situation as what takes place after 4 years. So for Manila now, it's absolutely urgent to institutionalize its partnerships today. So not only forging partnerships, but institutionalizing them. And that would really guarantee continuity despite shifts in national political dynamics.
So basically, we're in it for the long haul with China. So you mentioned about China's expansionism. So in your interview with Asia Society, you discussed the Philippines' role as a rising middle power. Perhaps you can explain to our listeners, what does this mean and what are its implications for the country and for the region?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this has become quite it has gained a lot of attention actually. So particularly when Lowy Institute in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, the Lowy Institute in Australia published their Asia Power Index report, and it labeled the Philippines as a middle power, right? So that really got the discussions going more, right? Not to say that there weren't before that, but that really catalyzed more discussions as to whether the Philippines as a middle power, right? So academically speaking, in fact, my paper on this is soon to be published, my journal article on this. So we have to understand, being a middle power is not static, right? So traditionally speaking, there is no solid or concrete definition of what a middle power is, but it is often traditionally described or defined based on a behavioral or positional concept, meaning, so these are states, these are countries that are not great powers, but are not small powers either, right? So they have that level of material capabilities that would provide them some sort of agency in ensuring that the established order remains intact, remains robust, right? And that is the initial position of the middle power, to ensure also that within a varied clusters of major powers, the middle power, of course, has that ability to exercise its flexibility, engaging with all sides, and at the same time getting all sides together, right? So a middle power is actually faced with a lot of responsibilities. But however, traditionally, the concept of middle powers have often been looked at from a position or behavioral position, right? So I've argued that we need to look at it based on its role as well. And being middle power means that it has to be relational, right? When say that something is relational, it means it is not only accepted by yourself, you yourself accepting it is not enough, but it should be accepted by the wider power dynamics in the system, in the international system. So what we're seeing now is that the Philippines today, particularly today, has been actively pursuing the goal of playing a larger role in contributing to the peace and stability of the rules-based order, the established order, right? And from there has been growing recognition among major powers as well regarding our role, our significance in contributing towards the strengthening of the established order at the time of peril from revisionist states, right? And
Yes.
in that regard, we didn't have that sort of dynamics 6 years ago, that level of relational attribution. As many major powers are quite confused as to what the Philippine position was, right? It was only till the U-turn towards the end. But still today, we have not only positional and behavioral dynamics, but we also have relational dynamics of being a middle power. And I think that is very important.
And going with that middle power approach, actually, we should be talking with other middle powers and rising tigers in the ASEAN region. So one of the questions from our commenters was, against the backdrop of ongoing tensions between China and the Philippines, like ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia are clearly veering towards the industrial and economic might of China, and dismissing any legitimate claims. Like in Malaysia and Indonesia's case, their overlapping disputes with China seems to be taking a back seat compared to the Philippines, which is right there. We're taking the front row when it comes to these disputes. So how should we be how will Philippine policy set the tone in ASEAN specifically, or can we actually do anything here in the region, or will there be anything like ASEAN centrality, or are we basically on our own and we need to start talking to allies and partners privately?
Well, we have to understand the limitations of ASEAN member countries, right? We have to understand the limitations of our immediate neighbors and really taking an active role towards issues that we consider to be the most pressing in terms of maritime security, for instance. There is really no consensus in this, right? And the only consensus is that there is no consensus towards, high political areas, right? Especially ones that involve major powers or great powers, of course. However, we have to understand that this does not mean that this would be the permanent feature of ASEAN countries, right? History has shown us that ASEAN countries have been quite susceptible to change, right? And ASEAN countries have been quite, flexible for change. What is often considered as the ASEAN way, the very norms of non-interference, flexibility, consensus building, etc. They are not always applied uniformly and collectively at all times. So, for instance, in 2005 to 2009, if I'm not mistaken, ASEAN countries became more assertive towards the situation in Myanmar, to the point that they really didn't really follow through with a completely non-interference norm of the ASEAN Main. They have actually become more, involved in the situation in Myanmar at that time. That was because they felt that they needed to do so, or else they would be losing the support of the Western countries, the European countries, who many of them relied on for economic and political concessions, right? And similarly, when we had the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, in 2019, which was eventually adopted, it was initially the brainchild of Indonesia, but many ASEAN countries were very reluctant to even talk about the Indo-Pacific. But then the idea was socialized collectively and individually towards ASEAN countries, and eventually it was accepted, right? So what does that tell us, right? It tells us that we need to work in socializing our issues with our ASEAN neighbors as well, not only
Yes.
from the government's position in Manila, but also in terms of our embassies abroad in other countries. So there's a lot of potential in that, but we also have to take it understanding the limitations of their involvement.
But I guess before we go to Alex's question, a lot of the pro-China talking points in this country is that the Philippines is isolated in the region, that the other ASEAN countries are mahinhin, they're much more gentle, they're much more reserved, and the Philippines is causing a lot of the drama. So realistically, is the Philippines really alone in the region when it comes to facing China, or when it comes to acting this way? And what can we realistically hope to achieve from our Asian brothers in bilateral talks or what have you?
Well, if we're talking about standing up to China in the West Philippine Sea, I do not think that ASEAN countries would be involved. I think that this is quite clear. They would not want to be involved, right? And we could see this generally speaking, right? And what we have to do is that, given this reality, this is why the Philippines is now positioning itself, not just as a Southeast Asian country, right? It's also the perception. When you say that you're just a Southeast Asian country, it seems that you are boxing yourself in within the region, right? But what we're doing now is that we are operationalizing our status as an Indo-Pacific nation, and I think President Marcos Jr.'s speech in Singapore a few months back. It illustrated that the Philippines has claims, has stakes, has interests not only within the immediate Southeast Asia, but also to its utmost east towards the Pacific Islands, and its utmost west towards the Indian Ocean. And that allows us to become the fulcrum for cooperation between and among like-minded countries. So this is where we'd have to leverage our partnerships, really, in addressing the deficiencies within our immediate neighborhood. But this does not mean that we are taking ASEAN for granted, or we are not, we are not, that we don't appreciate ASEAN. No, as President Marcos Jr. has said, ASEAN remains integral in Philippine strategic calculations. But of course, as a sovereign state with our own agency and our own interests, we have to do what is best in diversifying our options, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Very interesting points, Don. So we have a question from the comment section. So it says here, as the Philippines forge stronger relations with the likes of US, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, how will this help the country improve its military capability aside from its current push under the revised, AFP modernization program and commitments on troops exchange under VFA or similarly crafted arrangements?
And it's a very
Yeah.
fitting question because you were talking about how we should be looking beyond ASEAN also when it comes to our alliances, and so the Western allies are a good are a good default.
Absolutely, I definitely agree, and this is where we would be tested in terms of our ability to negotiate our diplomatic skills, right? As a country, as a nation, in ensuring that these partnerships that we have will be not only institutional and not only institutionalized, but would also reflect our greater interest within these arrangements, right? So, for instance, what we have with Japan, we were the first to receive Japanese official security assistance, and this is, of course, in line with what we need in order to enhance our position, our maritime security capabilities and navigation. And I think a more recent example is how we were able to leverage our growing partnership with Canada in order to utilize, the navigation system of Canada in order to monitor dark ships, right? And that is where we were able to find out the positions of, the largest Chinese Coast Guard, for instance, that has been trying to intimidate the BRP Teresa Magbanwa, right? So we are able to leverage that in order to facilitate our immediate concerns. And of course, with South Korea, there has been a new trilateral announced between the U.S., South Korea, and Philippines towards revitalizing our shipbuilding industry, which is absolutely crucial in facilitating the process towards self-reliance, right? And this particular aspect must be emphasized, right? So our partnership should go beyond the transactional buyer-seller arrangement, but should also focus on allowing us to build on our capabilities. And this is why I have emphasized that the Philippines must continue to negotiate towards technology transfers as well, in order to improve our domestic capabilities as well. So this is a stepping stone for that, right? And as we deepen our cooperation, we would also obviously be able to negotiate at a better footing. And I think that we're heading there. As we can see, a lot of important breakthroughs have been achieved with our partnerships with countries in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So we have to continue this.
Don, so let's go back to the U.S. Philippines relationship. So you chatted to a journalist from Benar's News about China's expertise in exploiting certain terminologies of the U.S. Philippines MDT. So is China's gray zone tactics getting the better of the USPH Mutual Defense Treaty? And what can Manila and Washington do to further strengthen the treaty, at least revise its implementation? What do you think?
Well, it's not about revising. It's not about it's quite interesting how some some people, some academics here have been calling for changing or revising the MDT. I think whatever is written in the MDT is actually reflective of our current position. And what we are doing now is we are trying to clarify the positions. We're trying to cement the provisions of the MDT. So, for instance, there's also been this speculation that okay, we have to trigger one
Right.
particular aspect of the MDT,
Yes.
right? So the MDT is already operationalized, right? It provides a consultation method between the United States and the Philippines to address current threats, potential threats, and to see what both of them can do to address them. So this is not only limited to military activities, right? This is also possibly involving economic plans, diplomatic plans, cultural plans, etc. So, of course, the MDT, when you say that it is triggered or we need to trigger it, etc., I mean, it's already activated, right? It's already providing us the consultation mechanisms that we need to work with the United States to address current issues. But it's all about the art of negotiation and how both states would be able to complement each other's interests towards a shared problem. See, so that's as I mentioned, that's where we would have to test the level of negotiation. Um, and of course, China has been trying to see how far it could go. How far it could go in getting away with whatever it's doing in terms of provoking the Philippines within its own waters, right? And as we can see, what happened on the 17th of June was something that that often raised eyebrows towards what else we can do in the long run. So I believe that both sides, Washington and Manila, are already in discussing this, obviously, and this is why, from our side, we have been quite clear when General Bronner was, in fact, quite clear on
Mhm.
addressing the belligerence of China in the future with the same level of pushback, is something that is very much proactive because it provides a proportional response, right? So the idea of proportionality is also something that we need to take into consideration, right? So this is where the complications come in terms of our strategic calculations.
So I guess we're talking about proportionality here. Natural. We've got one of the questions also in the chat, as the Philippine Coast Guard is determined, and as you can see now has deployed the Teresa Magbanwa for several months further. So how will it fare in its leadership in keeping this leverage whilst ensuring that the ship is well maintained? And how can we ensure that we're maintaining a level of proportionality out there when we're sending our assets out there in the West Philippine Sea?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Chinese have been quick to sort of express their discontent towards this, obviously, because again, it hampers their expansionism, right? It clearly hampers their expansionism. So that's why they have their largest Coast Guard ship trying to intimidate us, the Teresa Magbanwa particularly. But what we're trying to do is that we're trying to show that we are determined. We have become more determined in ensuring a consistency in our presence in these particular waters, right? The Escoda Shoal, for example, is of great importance to the Philippines, particularly as it's within our exclusive economic zone. So, and obviously, China has that intent of utilizing such areas and slowly trying to wear down our forces and its position to become more established, like setting a new norm within that. So the Philippines was quick enough to ensure that it does not have that level of free run. But again, this goes back to your question. The larger issue here is that we need to ensure that our vessels are in tip-top shape, right? And that is why we also need to improve our capabilities for quick repair and the quick repair level of our of our position to really address these essential areas. So we need to work on our capabilities for quick repair, and the delivery of such capabilities is crucial, especially at this point in time. And I think that this is where we would be able to leverage through sharing of best practices with our partners as well. And this is also calling for us to invest more in our young labor force, particularly by equipping them with the right skills, right? Research and development, and investing in providing them with the right skill set. So this will definitely go a long way. So again, this leads to what we again call as a whole of a nation approach, where even civil society plays a huge role. Private sector plays a huge role in cementing our position in the West Philippine Sea. So again, this also deals with our capacity for maintenance and repair, right? And this is something that perhaps could be addressed as we forge closer relations with South Korea and the US, and they have expressed their interest in this as well.
And going back to our allies and also to the MDT, which we were going back earlier, I get, and this also goes back to proportionality. Many people here in the Philippines are just curious, where is the red line done? Because people are talking about, are the Americans going to help us if it push comes to shove? And naturally, the more pessimistic or the more pro-Beijing crowd would be like, we're playing with fire because the Americans aren't going to help. So where is the red line for the Philippines, in your opinion? And do you expect that red line to be crossed anytime soon?
Well, we have to understand one thing first, right? We have to lay this particular fact, is that China itself is not willing to risk a shooting war, right? So we have to understand that, despite having quantitatively the largest navy, for instance, its navy's operations are also still quite constrained as well. If we look into what has happened in Russia, Russia just needed to cross the border, as it sought to invade Ukraine. But as we could see, the plan is not going as well as planned, right? So it has been bogged down considerably. And in order for China to really pursue an all-out a war in this regard is quite, is quite, it's actually very risky for China as well. So we have to first understand what China is trying to do. It's trying to rattle us. It's trying to provoke us. It's trying to make us fearful of the fact of war, right? And that is something that we need to take into consideration. And this has also been the line of these information operations operating within the country that we are for war, right? So without a proper understanding of what China is trying to do, then we often fall victim to such narratives, and which is dangerous and also undermines the multifaceted approach of our government towards the West Philippine Sea, while ensuring that lines of communication remain open, right? But as far as the red line is concerned, of course, I understand that there is this concern given our history with the alliance as well, and of course our concerns of the clarity towards the alliance. But as we can see, I think the stakes are far too high for the United States to to once again leave an open vacuum in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that we could see this with the momentum surrounding our alliance.
And I want to do a quick follow-up to that before we go to Alex with a comment question. You mentioned two things. You mentioned that China is unwilling to engage in a shooting war, and the United States, there's too much at play for the United States to simply let us go. So perhaps we can parse that, because naturally several people will point to when the Chinese took out the Vietnamese over at Johnson South Reef, and they sunk several of those Vietnamese transport ships. So I guess the question is, why wouldn't that happen with Manila? And specifically, why would the Americans not allow that to happen? Because it's a great point in order to debunk a lot of the pro-Beijing talking points here in the Philippines about how the Americans will let it happen?
Well, we have to understand one thing, right? When it comes to Vietnam, I often hear that, we are often compared to either we should do what Vietnam is doing or exactly what you've said, what if China does that to us, to our boats, sinking them, etc. So here's one thing, right? One reason that we have, one particular factor that we have that Vietnam doesn't is, of course, the alliance, right? And this has served for better or for worse, a deterrent, for Beijing. So it is much more calculative in terms of to what extent it could actually engage with us, right? So it has been often, engaged in particular tactics that fall short of that level of provocation, right? But nonetheless, provocation. However, on the other hand, some may say that, okay, why can't we be like Vietnam, that we could escalate and then de-escalate right away? I said that we are ensuring that we have that level of flexibility, as I've said, as we continue to engage with China in all forms, all levels, right? In fact, our imports from China have increased as well. But at the same time, what Vietnam doesn't have is, of course, the alliance, which gives it that maneuvering to escalate and de-escalate, right? And of course, that whole factor of party-to-party ties, right? So while we have the advantage, we also have particular limitations in comparing our situation with that of Vietnam. But of course, as I mentioned, China is a calculative power. It would not go all out guns blazing just like that. It is in constant evaluation of the cost and the benefits that it would attain. So for now, China feels that it is gaining more by not overtly engaging in military force, and it has been gaining not only in the South China Sea but in the East China Sea as well. So the challenge here is for us to actually incorporate these gray zone activities into our response with our alliance, right? So this is a challenge that we have to include. How do we include these gray zone activities, and what would be the best way to address them, given that China has been doing this for so long and continues to have a free run in this regard, right? So while China is limited in terms of the shooting war instance, but it is still gaining the advantage through these gray zone activities. So to be able to put cost on these gray zone activities is crucial, and something that we have to really take into account with our negotiations with the United States.
Don, you mentioned about gray zone activities, and of course, that includes the use of disinformation, cyber warfare, and of course, uh, furthering pro-China narratives on social media as well. So there is a question from a commenter. What can the Philippines do in the PRC's active campaign to try to divide the country from within via propaganda and infiltrating various sectors of the government with their influence, as stated by I think General Bronner in his latest statement? So what do
Right.
you think we can do to combat that?
Right. So we have to understand, right? Information operations are an element of sharp power projection, right? Sharp power projection talks about mostly coming from authoritarian countries that try to really sow discord in society through disinformation, through information operations, and of course, utilizing media and technology as a pathway, as an avenue for such activities. And of course, the problem here is that sharp power projection is often done at the expense of free and democratic societies such as the Philippines, where media and the press are quite free, right? And this is their opportunity, and where such social media is also largely unregulated compared to how it is in authoritarian countries, dictatorships. So that is the advantage that soft power projection has for these authoritarian countries like China, is that they are able to infiltrate and take advantage of our very democratic society, right? And that is clearly a problem in terms of these disinformation campaigns that we are clearly seeing today. However, while there has been an increase in such information operations, particularly since 2023, as we can see from all the national surveys conducted towards the opinions of Filipinos across all areas in the country, across wide, varied age groups and all that, we can see that Filipino public opinion towards what we are doing in the West Philippine Sea still remains resilient and robust and highly supportive of the government, right? And that is because of the clarity of our signaling, of Manila signaling towards its position in the West Philippine Sea. As I mentioned, the three variables of our strategy being people-centric, defense-oriented, and agency-driven. But of course, this does not mean that such numbers would be persistent all throughout, as information operations are on the rise and continue to be on the rise. And of course, their ability to sort of mix and match other issues, linking it to this issue, such as the national economic issue, etc. So this would have to, of course, be addressed again by a whole of the nation approach. So it's not only the government addressing this, but of course involving civil society to also take part in actually maintaining a clear position on what's actually happening on the ground, right? And this is where the Transparency Initiative has been quite successful, in letting the Filipinos know what's actually happening, right? And this has been a major factor in contributing to positive opinions towards the Philippine position. So we have to have more robust synergies within and across society, along with the government and the private sector as well.
Okay, so Don, we're talking about some common divisive rhetorics or propaganda lines that we usually see and hear on social media. So very quickly, just 3 points, three talking points. So what can you say if somebody argues in social media that in the issue of West Philippine Sea, Philippines is becoming or is being labeled as Ukraine 2.0? So how can you counter argue this rhetorics?
We're being marched into the slaughter of the Western war machine, apparently, according to some people in this
Yeah,
country.
so that's the first. So that's the first point. Yeah, Philippines is Ukraine 2.0. So how do you counter argue this?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, the best way to counter this is, of course, to look into the facts on the ground. And facts on the ground are clearly the opposite of what they are trying to say. And that in itself is one of the major, one crucial one crucial point that really sets back these these erroneous propaganda, particularly, and to actually see what we are doing. So there has been a lot of activities that the government has been doing to inform the public, right? And of course, it's important to engage in robust and objective academic discourse as well. So it again is something that we need to take into consideration in our overarching position towards the West Philippine Sea in particular. So all these aspects are aimed at keeping the Filipino people, the public in general, very much limited in their ability to properly scrutinize what is actually going on. It's trying to keep them in this box, right? And the alternative here is to provide the public with access and information that is actually happening, information that is actually being operationalized, right? And that in itself is important. Because reality is around us, right? It's just a matter of looking at the right place.
Yes.
Right. So that's a major thing, right? So these information operations try to keep the public into some sort of negative comfort zone and and sort of engaging them and making them echo chambers for whatever reason, right? So the need here is to shine light into these particular shadows, right? And I think that is, that provides us who are clearly seeing that we are in the right side of history, the right side of international law, the right side of our foreign policy. That that is a responsibility that we have, and I'd like to commend you guys for for engaging with scholars and also people from the government in this light. And this goes a long way. This goes a long way. So this is not something that could be done in just an instant, because as you try to repel these erroneous information, they would come back with more and more and more, right? So this should be an ongoing process, an ongoing, especially now that we are at a critical juncture in our foreign policy and our security policy.
Okay, Don, another propaganda line. Can you tell our listeners how is this statement, yes, is erroneous and false? So this is a common thing that we see on social media posts. So what can you say if somebody argues to you that Philippines is a vassal state of the U.S.?
It's colonial mentality.
I
Or
mean,
yeah, go on.
yeah. I mean, it's clear that we aren't. And in fact, that as I mentioned, that was the second variable in our current position, is that we are agency driven, right? So we have been quite clear, okay? So that what we are doing and the partnerships that we have, the alliance that we have, is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. What is the end? The end is for us to secure what is properly left of the status quo, right? So we are not trying to provoke the status quo. We are trying to secure what is left of it, or whatever is left of it, right? Point here is that means has also been clear towards various foreign policy positions that do not necessarily reflect the great interest of the U.S., right? So whether it be limiting the number of bases, whether it be keeping a balanced position towards Taiwan, or whether it be the situation in the Middle East, for instance, we have shown our ability to deviate from the larger interests of the United States, but we have also shown that in areas particularly that of great importance to us, of course, our ability to work with what we have, and of course, as a country with limited resources, we have to leave it to our diplomatic prowess to really make the most out of our partnerships, and that's what we have been. That's what we have been doing, and that's clear. That's clear. What we are trying to do is that we are trying to not only expand our maritime security capabilities, but also to enhance our resilience in both economic and political realms. So I think that we are very clear on that, and I think the Philippines is very clear on its position. It's just that our position is controversial, particularly to China, is
Yes.
because it felt that it already was able to to constrain our mindset, particularly under the previous administration. And now we have a new administration that is quite clear on what it actually wants for the benefit of the Filipino people. And that is, of course, something that has made China quite irritated, right? So it's using all these terms, narratives, vassal state, etc., to discredit what the Philippines is doing for the Philippines.
And I guess one of the last talking points that you often hear is that China is a rising power, and as all rising powers, it's inevitable, and it will take over the region in a Monroe Doctrine style plan, and the Philippines should be aligning with it as a fellow Asian state rather than allying with its former colonial masters. What would you say about that? That China's rise is inevitable, and we might as well play ball. Can we even resist?
Well, here's the thing, right? China's rise is inevitable to the point that we can see that it would continue to grow to a certain level. But of course, what comes after that, given the demographic crisis and all things that are happening within China, the economic challenges that China is actually facing now, puts into question to what extent. That's a topic for another day. What we are doing is that we are encouraging, we are leaning towards what we call a multipolar Indo-Pacific, right? A transition towards multipolar Indo-Pacific. See, China talks about multipolarity, but it disagrees with multipolarity, because multipolarity means, with other major powers providing alternatives to less powerful states, particularly, right? What China wants is it wants domination, right? And from what we can see, we talked about our former colonial powers, and of course, the need to work with other Asian powers like China, etc. But what we could clearly see here is that it is China and not the United States that poses a direct risk and threat to our borders, to our sovereignty, to our sovereign rights, right? So we really have to deal with that. So there have been also concerns about Japan. Ironically, in some policy, in some voices within the country as well. But what we have to look at is what is happening in the present, right? And as far as we are concerned, it is China that is continuously serving as a threat to our sovereignty and sovereign rights. But regardless of that, we still choose to engage with China, right? And that shows that we are trying to ensure, right, that from our end, our position is clear, and that is that we will continue to engage China in all levels. But that does not mean that when it comes to its narrowly driven designs for our key interests, that we would continue to sit like sitting ducks, right? So we have shown that we are able to stand up in areas that are of immediate concern to us. But at the same time, we are mature enough to engage in different levels as well.
So we have a phone-in question. So we've talked about how Philippines can pursue a robust and dynamic relationships with its allies in the areas of defense. So a question here is: will the strengthening of defense ties between Philippines and Spain and other European countries eventually extend to shipbuilding, or basically having our own industry?
Yeah, technology transfer.
Yeah, technology transfer in the future. Will this lead to that?
Well, I hope so. I really hope that our partnerships with technologically powerful countries like South Korea, like Japan, some countries in Europe, even the Czech Republic, which has also shown great interest to work with the Philippines in technology cooperation, would provide us with a pathway to really, to really maximize what we can procure in terms of technology that we are talking about, right? And this is a very important step towards self-reliance, right? Self-reliance is basically a goal that we have, or that we should definitely cement in terms of um, you making sure that we have the resources for ourselves to make most of any situation for ourselves in key and critical industries, given the uncertainty of international politics, right? So again, this would rely on our ability to negotiate, our ability to set the parameters for cooperation, and I believe that with a consistent outlook in this level, we will be able to do so. And of course, we're looking into cooperation with European countries like France, for example. France has actually been one of the most generous European powers that have allowed technology transfers for defense, for instance. So I think that there's a lot of potential, especially as we're working on enhancing defense cooperation with France, that there's a lot of potential for such aspects as well. So, I think it's all about realizing what we're working with and realizing the potential of what they're working with. So, yeah, it all leads to that.
Mhm. Well, we can't really let an interview with you pass up without discussing India as a rising Asian power and its role in the region. So we've talked about European countries. Can you explain to our listeners what India's rise means when it comes to Philippines' security and economic interest in counterbalancing China in Asia?
Right, right. Right. So at one point, to start with, the Philippines and India are both democratic Indo-Pacific countries that share common goals for the region, right? That's clear, which makes India and the Philippines, a very natural partnership, right? However, unfortunately, the partnership only began to take effect or gain significant momentum in 2016, as we were pursuing partnerships with non-traditional partners, right? So the problem here was a lack of awareness from both sides about each other's the potential of the partnership that both can actually muster. But since 2016, we have been seeing a lot of important
Mhm.
developments in the partnership, particularly on defense, right? And that's clear. From India's perspective, of course, there have been concerns whether India is able to double down on its now Act East policy and formerly Look East policy, right? Because of concerns
Yes.
in its immediate neighborhood. As we can see, India is located in the most complex geopolitical neighborhoods, two nuclear armed countries on both sides of the spectrum, seeking to nibble on its territory and really provoke its territorial integrity. So that has often been the idea that, okay, India would be limited to its position in the Indian Ocean region. But India now realizes that what takes place in the South China Sea is also directly impacting the security of the Indian Ocean. And as it continues to rise in material power, it seeks to translate its growing material capabilities into a robust and externally driven foreign policy. And this is where, since 2014, there has been an active involvement in Southeast Asia, and particularly the Philippines and India, both democratic countries, have been
Mhm.
able to really see, the potential of their partnership. So I feel that now that they have explored the robust nature of their cooperation, it is unlikely
Mhm.
to fall back, and it will continue to broaden, especially as both countries really converge on a lot of issues in the region.
So another question that came in was basically, naturally, we've got a lot of trade ties right now with India, specifically with like the military transfer. So related to that, the boosting military capacity. One of the questions was about the U.S. aid coming into the Philippines. U.S. the recently, as you may recall, the Philippines got $500 million in aid from the Ukraine budget, from the Ukraine aid bill. And then also the Philippines is expected to get about $2.5 billion over the span of 5 years from the PERA Act by Senator Kane, which is
Right,
bipartisan.
right.
So I guess the question is, what from the comments is what should we be prioritizing in your opinion when it comes to actual assets purchases for the AFP, and then what do you think we can do in order to get more from the West? Because there's talks from people here in Manila, like Professor Hidarian and Elbridge Colby in the United States, agreed that this is chump change compared to what they're giving to places like Ukraine or what they're giving to places like even Pakistan, for that matter. So how can we expand this?
Well, it's true. This has been a growing concern here in the country as well. That countries like Egypt and Pakistan are actually getting a larger share of the support when it comes to defense modernization, which is true. And I think that this should be, and this is of course in line with the overarching interest of the United States to really prioritize, for instance, the Persian Gulf. And at that time, the situation in Afghanistan, which has led to prioritizing its partnership with Pakistan, and of course Europe, right? And as we can see with the budget, the recent breakdown of the budget, the Indo-Pacific got, received the least amount in this regard. So of course, this is a structural issue that the United States must continue to recalibrate, given that I believe that the most consequential region for U.S. interest in the long term would be in the Indo-Pacific. There has to be that realization that while recognizing the threat Russia poses, and to an extent for the U.S. what it feels that Iran poses, China is much more than that. Because as mentioned in a clear and very clearly in a U.S. In a White House document in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, it was clearly pointed out that China is recognized as the only country with the material capabilities to back its revisionist ambitions in the Indo-Pacific vis-a-vis the rules-based order. So in this regard, I think China's economy is 10 times larger than Russia's, and much larger than Iran's, and of course it possesses the wherewithal to really disrupt the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, and given, of course, the vitality of various sea lines of communication in the Indo-Pacific, there has to be that prioritization, of course. So I believe that the United States is now realizing this, and it has sought to develop its Indian Ocean strategy, for instance, for the first time, which shows that it seeks to integrate this into its Indo-Pacific approach. So first of all, there has to be that recognition of the
Mhm.
parameters of the Indo-Pacific, right? And that would eventually lead to more recognition of the need to work closer and to develop the capabilities of key partners and allies such as the Philippines, right? So because it is in the U.S.'s interest to have a robust defense capability in the Philippines, right? I mean, for the Philippines, robust defense capacity. So that is, of course, in the U.S.'s interest. So there has to be that realization, that reorientation towards the U.S.'s strategic outlook and prioritization in the international system, right? So this is something that definitely I agree that we need to, Washington needs to orient its position more towards the Indo-Pacific.
Yes, thank you, Don. Another question from the comments. Of course, we've talked about China's expansionism and how they have set their sights on the West Philippine Sea because in this region, it is believed to hold significant reserves of oil and natural gas, of course, along with um maritime resources as well. So, what advice can you give to this current administration? Should we prioritize in finding or expanding or uh, natural resource in the West Philippine Sea? What should be the what should be the current administration be doing?
And how are we going to
Well,
drill for oil and gas if with Chinese belligerents out there like actively harassing our ships?
right, right. I agree that this is in fact a pressing issue. And when we talk about the energy security angle, this is of great concern, especially since the Malampaya gas fields are actually drying out, right? So we need to, of course, prioritize the diversification of our energy resources. And of course, as a growing economy, as a strengthening, developing country, energy resources or access to energy resources is of great concern for the Philippines. And of course, the West Philippine Sea provides that. But that is, of course, not a short-term to mid-term goal, but more of a long-term goal, given the process involved in really extracting the resources there. And of course, a bigger question is, the ability to access these resources, right? Given, of course, the temperament of China towards this particular activity. And of course, while countries like Vietnam and Malaysia had a head start much earlier on, to the point where Vietnam has even invited countries like India, private sectors in India like ONGC Videsh to really, for its oil fields in the South China Sea, it would be more controversial for us to act compared to that, right? So there are questions as, why did China allow them, at that point in time, and why is it difficult for us? Well, you have to understand that in the early 2000s, China was still incorporating its good neighborhood strategy, to show, a little bit of accommodation, right? Limited accommodation at that point. But Malaysia, for example, the new oil fields that it has, the new oil and gas fields, faced a lot of difficulty. It was harassed by Chinese Coast Guard ships. But of course, for us here in the West Philippine Sea, it would be, much more controversial, likely, given that we have not done, this sort of thing in the past, right? And of course, under the Duterte administration, there was this hope to have this joint venture with China, but clearly China wants things that are considered illegal in terms of our constitution, especially that this is ours, right? This is within our sovereign rights. So of course, pathways for this would be to work with potentially our neighbors, Southeast Asian countries, especially given that Vietnam, for instance, is more than willing now to engage in dialogue, right? And that has, if done correctly, we could see the potential for collaboration in this regard, and especially as we have submitted our extended continental shelf as well. That would and so have Vietnam and Malaysia in the past. That would allow us to become more grounded in negotiations for this with them, right? And we have seen that intra-ASEAN dialogue in terms of maritime boundary disputes have been quite successful, as we've seen Vietnam and Indonesia in 2022, for instance. So these are the options that we are currently looking at.
And the last question from the chat is Talonsky wants to ask, what will be the next step in Philippines and Japan relationships, especially after the signing of the reciprocal agreement for status of forces? I believe that's coming up. What's next after that? And he asked, would there be a chance of possibly an alliance between us two, a military alliance? Do you see a potential like Asian NATO coming out anytime soon, or would that be too hard? Or maybe at least something like the Five Powers defense agreement that you have with the old Commonwealth states?
Well, practically speaking, I don't think an Asian NATO, the collective security concept, will be materialized anytime soon. However, I'm not discounting that factor if structural problems continue to press on countries like Japan and the Philippines, against their legitimate interests, right? So if the structural conditions continue to exacerbate in exponential levels, right? We're still seeing that opening, right, of that possibility. But we're seeing now the level of cooperation between the Philippines and Japan is considerably deep, right? And what we are seeing now is a step towards having a quasi-alliance with Japan, right, which is still in the works, right? But regardless, despite it being, the level of quasi-alliance is more symbolic than it is operational, we can clearly see that there is that desire, even within Tokyo, to really maximize, the partnership it has with the Philippines, given that it feels that the Philippines clearly understands and shares the same strategic goals in the Indo-Pacific. And the fact that we were the first to receive the OSA is a clear indication of what Japanese believes to be, what Japan believes to be its interest towards solidifying our partnership with them. So what we're going to have 2+2, and hopefully the operationalization of the RAA. This would of course be a stepping stone for more integrated security cooperation, not just between Japan and the Philippines, but within the aspect of the Quad, or even the trilateral, or the extended hub and spokes networks. So, as I mentioned just very briefly, the partnership we have with Japan has become strong enough to stand on its own bilaterally. It is flexible enough to work within the U.S. alliance network, but it is also inclusive enough to work with other like-minded countries in the region. So, of course, this is the makings of a robust partnership, clearly.
Thank you, Don. One last question from me as we wrap up our podcast. So, how do you see Philippines-China relations evolving in the next few years?
Well, that would depend on a lot of factors, especially in terms of our for China. And as I said, there's clarity in terms of its consistency. And for us here, we have been endeavoring to maintain this consistent approach that we've seen recently, right? So, what I could say is that there will also be likely that level of continuity in terms of our approach and China's approach towards the Philippines, and the Philippine approach towards China. But at the same time, maintaining open lines of communication. Yeah. So in that regard, I don't think that there would be any groundbreaking developments within the next 3 or 4 years, if that's what you're asking. But definitely, this does not mean that we won't be doing anything new, but rather we would continue to build on our capabilities and strengthen our collective capabilities with our partners.
Thank you. So Don McLAIN Gill, thank you for taking your time with us here at SITREP PH. And thank you naturally for all the work and services you do for the Philippines, especially advancing Philippine interests. Do you want to plug any of your work or your social media account? Where can people find you? And do you have any interesting things coming up?
Well, yes, again, thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure to converse with you all on a number of important issues. And as far as social media handles are concerned, and I guess you have my Twitter, so that's pretty much the best way to reach me, or LinkedIn. So yeah, so again, thank you very much, and looking forward to more conversations.
Thank you. And this has been SITREP PH, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Philippine interests. This has been Ivan at home from Manila with my co-host Inform PH. And be sure to follow our social media handles for more updates on our upcoming podcasts and for the catalog of our previous podcasts. You can find us at SITREP PH on Twitter, for now X, and of course on YouTube at SITREP PH. And of course, you can also find us on Facebook.com/SITREP PH. This has been SITREP Philippines. Thank you and good night. Mabuhay.
Happy Sunday, everyone.
Happy Sunday.